Today's the LaGreca Look Back is presented by WWE on A&E. Watch the future greats of WWE emerge. WWE LFG premieres Sundays at 8, 7 Central, part of WWE Superstar Sunday, only on A&E. One of the things that I want to look back now that we're on the road to WrestleMania is going back to WrestleMania VIII. Now, I know for you, Bully, I know for our very own Tommy Dreamer, we loved the wrestling magazines. And one of the fantasy matchups, and now we talk about fantasy matchups all the time. And now there's, the Forbidden Door, and now the WWE's working with TNA and everything else. So we see these fantasy matchups a lot. The big fantasy matchup in the 80s that everybody wanted to see, and was like the cover of Pro Wrestling Illustrated, was Flair and Hogan. Those were the two champions. Ric Flair was the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. Hogan was the WWF Champion, and everybody wanted to see. There were actual arguments and fights. I remember getting into arguments with people at school with all the Hogan guys, because I was never a Hogan guy. I was always a Flair guy. And I would have actual arguments. For WrestleMania VIII, Bully, it looked like that was going to be your main event match. We saw the Royal Rumble. Ric Flair wins the WWF Championship at the Royal Rumble. Hogan gets eliminated. And even Jack Tunney, made Hogan the number one contender. So we all thought we were going to see Hogan and Flair, and it didn't happen on a big stage at WrestleMania. So what they did do is they had like a house show run of Hogan and Flair. I was actually at one of the matches. They had one at Madison Square Garden. It was a count out. And then they did, and then it never materialized. They never did Flair Hogan, and they wound up for WrestleMania VIII doing Hogan and Sid, which is, if we're gonna go by 5-star, Meltzer's 5-star rating was probably a -2. It was maybe one of the worst WrestleMania matches of all time. Flair had the match with Savage for the WWF Championship, and it was in the middle of the show. It was weird. It was a great match, but you always talk about, Bully, big business and what would make for big business. What would have made for big business is Flair versus Hogan. And it just shocks me, Vince McMahon, like the P.T. Barnum of professional wrestling, never pulled the trigger on Flair and Hogan in the WWF. And then it would take, 94 at Bash at the Beach before we saw Flair and Hogan in WCW on a major pay-per-view.
Dave, imagine we had a crystal ball and we could look into it and go back in time to all the conversations that took place with Vince McMahon and Hulk, or Vince McMahon and Flair, or Vince with his creative people at the time, a la Pat Patterson or whoever was around them at that time, as to why this never happened. I'm sure there's stories out there and, little bits and pieces of why it didn't. But I'm going to tell you the first thing that popped into my head when you started talking about Flair and Hogan and the possibilities of WrestleMania VIII. And this might sound crazy, but tell me what you think. Flair and Hogan almost sounds bigger than WrestleMania.
It really does, especially at that time, because this is the early days of WrestleMania. It's WrestleMania VIII. Now, it's such a roller coaster and there's so much momentum that nothing could be bigger than WrestleMania, the brand itself. But I always said there would be no WrestleMania without Hulkamania. And I'm sure if Hogan and Flair met at WrestleMania, Bully, Hogan would have beat Flair. Hogan was the guy. It's kind of like what we saw with WrestleMania 31 with DX beating the NWO. Don't get me down that. That's a whole nother look back that we've talked about many times. I'm sure Hogan would have won the match, but you had it right there. And there's a few things. One, and I want to get your take on it. One, I think, and we always hear that Vince McMahon kind of lived in his own bubble. I don't think he understood how big that match would have been, and I don't think he understood how much the fans wanted that match. And then you hear a lot of things about, well, they did a house show run, but it didn't really tear it up. They didn't have a lot of chemistry in the ring. I can only go by the match that I saw at the Garden. I thought it was great.
They weren't having 5-star matches on the loop, brother?
I don't think, Hogan wasn't having well, the quote unquote 5-star match. But I thought the match that I saw was really good. It was quick. I mean, it was like 10 minutes, which when it comes to Ric Flair, you're not used to seeing a 10-minute match. With Hogan, most of his matches were between 5 and 10 minutes long. And then the other thing was, people said that people were used to seeing Hogan against the big guys, like a one-man gang or a King Kong Bundy or a Sid. But Hogan's probably biggest feud of all time was with Roddy Piper. So to me, Ric Flair could have a great match with anyone, especially with a Hulk Hogan. I think it's a missed opportunity. I still imagine if we were able to get Flair and Hogan at a WrestleMania. Go ahead.
But when you think about, I'm going to try to get Flair and Hogan on Busted Open After Dark. When you mention Piper, right?
Yeah.
And Hogan's biggest rivalry being Piper, when you think of Hogan Piper, do you think of the verbal or the physical?
It's the verbal, but you could have both with Hogan and Flair.
I understand, but you bring up a good point about all of the guys that Hogan had faced back then. The WWE had programmed you to invest emotionally in Hulk Hogan because of all the men that were as big as him, if not bigger, that were able to get heat on him, which is very difficult. I believe that Vince McMahon treated Hulk Hogan the same way Vince Sr. and Jr. to an extent treated Bob Backlund. They always brought in imposing opponents for them that could get heat on Hogan. Maybe it was difficult for Flair, despite the fact that Flair was as credible as he was, one of the most credible of all time, if not the most credible. Because the WWE fan at the time, WWF fan at the time, was programmed to the big men, maybe it wasn't resonating with the fans. Maybe you loved it because you were a fan of the NWA also and you knew everything Ric Flair could do. But maybe that WWE fan base wasn't buying into it. I don't know this for a fact, by the way. I'm just trying to think about why it didn't happen. Listen, maybe it didn't happen because neither one of them wanted to do a job. It could be simple politics. But like you said, Rick goes an hour every night, 7 days a week and twice on Sundays, with the likes of Ricky Morton, Ricky Steamboat, and anybody else to that effect, and anybody else that was bigger than Flair. But the smaller heel against the bigger comic book star maybe wasn't the right chemistry for the WWE at that time.
I do think that kind of Vince McMahon at that time lived in his own bubble, saw Sid, saw the monster Sid was, thought that would be a bigger match for Hogan. Turned out to be an awful match, and then you had
but
Savage.
That kind of goes to what I'm just saying. Vince looking at the bigger, my God, look at the size of Sid. How he's going to be more credible than Ric Flair. That goes to the sizest thing.
It's funny because we look at pro wrestling now in 2025 and we talk about the lack of size in a lot of ways when it comes to wrestling. Back then, especially in the WWF, it was all about the size, especially going up against the Hulk Hogan. I just felt like, for me, and maybe it's too inside baseball. Maybe it's kind of like some of the discussions that we have here on Busted Open where we're not looking at the mass appeal. We're only looking at what the hardcore fan wants to see. But now with the legacy of Ric Flair, the fact that you had it in the palm of your hand and you never went with it, I think kind of tarnishes WrestleMania 8 and WrestleMania that it was actually a WCW pay-per-view that gave it to you first before WrestleMania.
You know, being down here in Orlando, Florida, at the PC, obviously to be taping LFG, doing Busted Open After Dark down here, I do have access to some of the more veteran minds, even more veteran than myself, a la like Shawn Michaels. I wonder if Shawn has an answer.
It's one of those things, like, I've heard it in the past, well, they didn't have the chemistry. It didn't. Yeah, but Hogan, judging from the match I saw at WrestleMania 8, Hogan and Sid didn't have that chemistry either. And I think it's one of those things that you know you're not going to get an awful match out of Hogan and Flair. Now, maybe it's...
But wait a minute. Wait a minute. What did you you just said something that's kind of... I don't want to say you were contradictory, but it sounds contradictory. You talked about their chemistry, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was it their physical chemistry in the ring? Or was it the chemistry of the egos?
I don't think there would be egos, especially with Flair at that time. I mean, listen, anybody
Dave,
would
you're
be
talking about Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair, and you said you don't think there'll be egos?
Well, that's probably, yeah, I'm probably off on that. Yes, you're probably, maybe egos was a problem.
I can't wait till Will Ospreay and Ricochet get a hold of that one.
All right, so it's funny, Bully, that when you look at that matchup, and you always look at big business, would it matter at the end of the day if you were able to have this great match? Hogan wasn't known for great matches anyway. If you had a match with Hogan and Flair, the business that you would be able to bring in for that, I mean, does it really matter?
Remind me of where WrestleMania VIII took place.
It was, I believe it was at the Hoosier Dome.
Do you think, so it was Hogan, Sid, Steamboat, Savage, Flair. Do you think the main event of Hogan and Flair at that time would have put more asses in seats?
Yes.
I mean, I don't see how it could not have. Do you think Hogan versus Flair would have been bigger than Hogan versus Andre?
No.
Do you think, I'm just, train of thought here. All right. I know you might not get this. The best league in soccer around the world is the English Premier League, okay? Mm-hmm. Manchester United, Manchester City, Chelsea, Liverpool. You get it, right? You've heard of all these big teams. All of these clubs that play in the English Premier League are the best of the best. The English Premier League is the top league in the world. But when it always came time for England to play, and all of these great English players would get on the field at the same time, the Wayne Rooneys of the world or the David Beckhams of the world, and all of the heavy hitters, they could never work together. They could never pull it off. They were never good, despite having what most would say were super teams. Maybe these guys just didn't have, maybe the best of the best, maybe two of the four faces on the Mount Rushmore of pro wrestling just couldn't get on the same page because they were so damn good at what they did individually. Flair being the master of the hour, Hogan being the master of the go straight to the heat, comeback finish. Maybe they couldn't agree.
Yeah, we got to get to the bottom of this. Because then there was 62,000 at the Hoosier Dome. So, like, listen, that's huge business. So I can't say that, would they have gotten 70,000? I don't know. But, like, I feel like that match, Hogan versus Flair, and if you go back to WCW, they did it, and it worked. I thought those were really good matches.
Wasn't it a little past? I don't want to say the primes. That's an age thing. But wasn't that past like
it was the first one was Bash at the Beach 94. So that's 2 years after you could have done it at WrestleMania. And
I don't have a memory. I don't have the memory of that match. I'm going to go by what you say. How was that match?
It was good. I thought it was really good. But the pomp and circumstance of WrestleMania, nothing can equal that. So Vince McMahon and that whole machine behind Flair and Hogan, just imagine how big that match would have been. And I guarantee you they would be bringing it up even today as one of the biggest matches in WrestleMania history.
To me, I don't know if you agree or not, as great as, listen, we saw Vince dim Dusty's light. We saw Vince dim the Road Warriors light. And to an extent, I thought they tried to dim Flair's light.
Yes.
And that is the one that always puzzled me. Why would you ever want to tamper with Ric Flair?
And they did it at the beginning because they brought him in as the real world champion, had him with Bobby Heenan. He wins the Rumble, wins the championship, and it just kind of fell apart from there. And you never get a real answer, but You had, and you can't tell me they didn't bring Flair in to face Hogan. Like, you don't bring him in, make him the real world champion if you don't have the plan to face Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. But the match never happened. That's today's LaGreca look back.